Good evening, everyone. This is TakeBack.org, and I'm Sheila, and every week we try to bring you something of interest, something for you to think about. We have a really great show today because we're talking about subjects that are so dear to everyone's heart. We're talking about memory, survival, tradition, connections to our heritage. And I have 4 wonderful Hadassah women who put on a magnificent program about Holocaust cookbooks. You would think that with the tragedies and the turmoil and the disasters in a concentration camp that people wouldn't want to talk about food, but yet it gave them the connection to their past, to their history, maybe some hope, maybe some yearning for their past. I want to start off with a story that I read in a book called Recipes Remembered, and then we'll get to our wonderful panel. Cecile Jerusham remembered the last meal that she shared with her mother. It was a typical Belgian lunch of steak, mashed potatoes, and Belgian endives. And she tells a story about how she hated Belgian endives and how that saved her life. It was 1943. She was 12 years old. When a non-Jewish friend stopped by during lunch and offered her the chance to go to voice lessons with her, she jumped at the chance, but her mother said, "Not before you finish your endives or I will save them for dinner." She put it off. She left with her friend. She didn't listen to her mother. While she was gone, her parents were arrested and sent to Auschwitz, where they ultimately perished. Cecile and her sisters survived the war by hiding in a Catholic convent. Now, she says, I eat those hated Belgian endives to be closer to my mother and the memories. And the recipe is in the book. So now I will start with introducing you wonderful, my Hadassah friends, who put on a wonderful program using books such as that to describe the recipes, the discussions of food, and how our loved ones who perished in the Holocaust and some who survived managed somehow to talk about the things they did in their homes and in their childhood and in their traditions. Karen Rosenberg. Hi, Karen.
Hello.
Karen is a member of Hadassah, and Karen was the chair of this wonderful program. Judy Deglin. Hi, Judy.
Hi.
Judy also has some wonderful history. One of her parents were Holocaust survivors. And Karen Blaustein. Hi, Karen.
Hello.
Karen helped tell the story of a person who made some recipes for the books. And Estelle Bogdanoff. Hi, Estelle.
Hi.
And I wanted to say that Karen Blaustein is also the co-president of the Eastern Connecticut chapter of Hadassah, so welcome on that. And Estelle also has families who were survivors in the Holocaust. Is that right?
That's correct.
That's correct. So let's start with you, Karen. How did you first envision the program? I think we have a photo of you and our other co-president, Carol Curlin, that we'd like to show as you introduced this wonderful program a few weeks ago. How did you envision that? Tell us about it.
Well, I wanted it to be something that shared stories, but I also wanted it to be an evening where we could just share our ideas and have delicious food and feel a connection to these Holocaust survivors who we were reading about and learning about. It was a beautiful evening, and there were wonderful stories and delicious food, but the idea began in like a lot of little conversations. There was a baby shower and a baby naming that had a special cake, and the cake came from this book, In Memory's Kitchen. That story, as I know it, begins with this cake, which is called a Gesundheit cake.
Right, I think we have a photo of that, of the book that you just kind of showed, In Memory's Kitchen. And you can show. Mm-hmm.
Right, and this is an interesting book. It has recipes, but not particularly ones that you can follow. They are handwritten by a woman named Mina Pachter while she was in Theresienstadt. Because in Theresienstadt, in that concentration camp, these women had a need to remember the life they used to live. And so they talked about the recipes that they loved to make they wrote them down on odds and ends pieces of paper, and then Mina put them together, hand sewn, but she had a premonition that she wasn't going to make it out of the camp. So she handed it off to a man who eventually was released, and she had told him that she wanted the book to go to her daughter who lived in Israel. Well, by the time he got out, she wasn't living in Israel anymore. 20 years later, the book showed up at the home of Annie Stern, and she was so touched by this book, and she wanted to do something with it, so she had it published with the anecdotes and with information about these people. And this book also had the Gesundheit cake. There was a shower for Rabbi Safman, who's the rabbi of Bethel in New London, and Meryl Mazzella made this cake for her.
From that particular
From that recipe, right, from the book. And someone else was there who decided that they wanted to make the cake for a baby naming. And so they made the cake for the baby naming. And as I understand it, though I was not there was a conversation at that baby naming that said, we should do a program about this. I ended up involved with it because I offered to have it at my house. And I found out soon after that would make me chairman of it. And I asked Estelle, because I knew that she had interest in doing this in doing this kind of a program. But I wondered kind of from Estelle why you were so interested in doing this program.
Well, as Sheila mentioned, almost all of my family are Holocaust survivors, both of my parents. So my aunts and uncles are both survivors. And of course, I'm Jewish, and food is very important to us. So I really wanted the connection between remembrance and honoring, especially now that my mother has passed, and she was a real balabusta, which she was an artisan in the kitchen.
We have to explain balabusta for everyone who might be watching.
So a balabusta is someone who goes beyond cooking and cleaning, who really embraces it. And
like getting master points.
Right, master points, like being a master baker without attending the CIA,
right.
the Culinary Institute of America.
She's someone who makes the house into a home.
Right, she makes the house into a home. That's a wonderful way to put it. And she really was an artisan in the kitchen, and she also just every single day she was baking and cooking. I think it was partly her way of working out what happened to her during the war, and also then sharing and remembering. And we carried those traditions on. So I felt it was really important that people hear the stories and then celebrate them also by tasting the food that they left behind.
Well, when you heard about this, Estelle, did you have all of those feelings before as you lived through your mom's and the experience with the food, or did the knowledge about this book and the stories in it awaken all of that in you? Do you know what
No,
I'm
I
saying?
think that
You think it
I
was
lived
already living
through
in
it.
that?
There were a lot of traditions in our family. All the aunts, who were actually almost all American, but all the uncles on my dad's side were all survivors, of all coming together for all the holidays and cooking together and cooking these traditional dishes. And I think with my mother, what she made and some of the things I chose to make, that she actually made for my son's bris, those were all embedded in me.
Did she ever talk to you about her specific experiences in the camp?
Yes.
Discussing food? Because that, I mean, that's the thing that seems so incongruous. Here they are practically actually starving, and with almost so much despair and no hope, and yet they can still have discussions about recipes. I mean, that is what is so amazing. Did she ever talk about
My
that?
mother's experience that she related to me was very different. So what she related to me about food was the starvation, and how even before the war, and how she would hide small pieces of bread from her mother so she could share it with the babies. and how she had to leave to go work so that they could have food. And then during the war, she was fortunate enough to be with her sister, and how they would try and look out after each other. It really was afterwards that she really took on this role. And I did ask her, how did she learn to do all this? She left home when she was about 10 years old to work. She said, well, I got married. It was the Shabbat. I had to make a nice dinner and challah. I just did it.
Right.
So it really came after.
Yeah. Well, I didn't have any Holocaust experience in my background directly with my family, but reading about this program and hearing it, and it was so great, it did awaken in me the importance of food in the Jewish community. I mean, it's number one in life: making the food, preparing the food, eating the food. What's the matter? You don't like the food? You don't want seconds or thirds? Such an important part of the traditions of the Jewish community. Let me ask Judy, and we're going to go through more specifically your experiences, Estelle, and the other stories. How did this program resonate with you, based on your experience?
Well, my parents came from Germany in 1937 and 1938, from different parts of Germany, and met here. My mother came here, leaving behind her mother and her 10-year-old sister, and my grandmother and my aunt were deported in 1942 and died in Treblinka concentration camp. And cooking traditional foods from Germany, not necessarily Jewish foods, but sort of secular, more German cooking, was sort of something that always went on in my household. And referring to sort of what Estelle was saying, I think a lot of us spend a lot of time watching our mothers cook. And even though we weren't measuring and weighing, we saw the techniques.
Oh, our grandmothers.
Sort of right.
Our aunts and grandmothers.
Right. So I have my father's mother's cookbook, and there were this fruit bread that I made is something that was made a lot when I was, not necessarily when I was a little child, but as I got older, my parents would make it always in the wintertime to give to friends. And it was such a big, involved process, and like many other recipes, nobody ever wrote anything down, although the recipe was adapted from this 1895
We're going to show those
Yeah.
things a little later. So yeah.
Those.
How about Karen? Karen B., what resonated with you about this project?
Well, neither my parents nor my grandparents were survivors, because by some visionary idea they had, they all left when they were teenagers. And so they were not directly involved, although my grandparents brought over one set of survivors, and they met in a truck going to a DP camp, which is displaced persons.
Mm-hmm.
And then somehow my grandparents found them and brought them to Chicago, which is where they lived. And, we kind of always knew that they were that, but when I was little, I had no idea what that meant. But this program was just wonderful.
It was. So we get back to Karen now. And do we show the Miracles and Meals book? Did we show the photo? There we go.
We didn't.
Yes. Why don't you talk about that?
One of the ways we set up the evening was we looked for volunteers, and Estelle and I went through cookbooks, and particularly this one, Miracles and Meals, and found recipes that spoke to us, and asked if there were people who would volunteer to not only make the recipe, but also to talk about either the person's story or whatever. And that's how Karen got involved in cooking for the evening. And we had several others, but Karen had a very interesting person that she inspired this recipe.
Right, and she'll get to talk about that.
And we'll talk about it later?
Sure.
Okay,
sure.
good.
We're going to talk about
one of the things I wanted to say was that in Memory's Kitchen, they explained that what the reason that these women talked about recipes was they wanted to keep in their minds the life that they had once had, with the hope of going back to it again, and talking about the foods that they loved and the things that they wanted to remember help them just get through the day, get through the weeks, get
Absolutely.
through the years.
Right. There have been some sociological discussions of it, Holocaust historians, and I just want to quote something that came out of the things that I've been reading about this fascinating topic. It said, people who were starving not only reminisced about their favorite foods, but they also had discussions, even arguments, about the correct way to prepare the dishes that they might never be able to eat again. And another Holocaust scholar said, discussing food brought them back to a place where they had food, where they had family, where they had a table, where they had children. It was an important psychological act of resistance. Very fascinating, very interesting. Yeah. So why don't we, something about an Oma and a Bella, I remember from
Oma and Bella.
Okay.
Well, I think the incentives for this program came from a lot of different directions. And one was from these cookbooks, and one was from Children of Survivors. And our friend Cecile had seen a documentary that was shown in our local international film festival called Oma and Bella.
There they are.
And these are two ladies who became friends here. And they would share their stories, and they would share their recipes, and they loved to cook together. And they came up with their own cookbook. And it helped them enjoy and remember their past. And so that was Oma and Bella. And the recipe that was made from that cookbook was blintzes. Most of us have some recipe for blintzes or buy them frozen, but the taste we remember.
What are blintzes?
Blintzes are like crepes that traditionally are filled with either like pot cheese or potatoes. And
Cherry sometimes.
Sometimes that used to be on top.
Okay.
Now they make cherry
Maybe,
ones and
okay.
blueberry ones and who knows what else.
Right.
We actually traditionally eat blintzes on our next holiday of Shavuot because it's a dairy product, and we eat dairy on that holiday.
And you have it with sour cream
Had it
usually.
with sour cream, and it was a wonderful meal to eat. When I think of my childhood, my mother had these beautiful dairy dishes that she only brought out for special occasions, and eating blintzes on Shavuot is the time I remember them most.
Okay. I mean, that's how important, even for us who may not have had the experience of the tragedies of World War II, we still have all those wonderful food experiences to think about.
I noticed when we were looking for recipes, there was a recipe for, it was called an apple kuchen, and I'm reading through it, and I said, that's not what my mother called it. Now, my grandmother was born in this country, and we also don't have any connection to the Holocaust that my parents ever talked about, but I do remember that apple kuchen, which she called apple flitten, and that was one of the things I chose to make that night because it reminds me of my childhood.
Right, and we'll show a picture of the table later. Everybody who took on a piece of history, took on a person, prepared a dish.
Right.
And we ate, had a wonderful time eating and enjoying those dishes afterwards, so it was just great.
The conversation afterwards was fabulous. People just talking about things from their background, talking
Right.
about what their blintzes tasted like, and it was wonderful.
It was, it really was. All right, let's turn to Estelle now and start what kind of the thing that we saw that night, where you introduced your connection to the Holocaust, to your family, to the food. Why don't we start with you?
Okay, so as I mentioned, both of my parents are Holocaust survivors.
Okay.
My mother is from a small shtetl called Nalipina in the Carpathian Mountains. There were 9 living children, only the 4 eldest survived. And my grandparents also did not survive. And my father was from about 50 kilometers away, a suburb of Munkach, which Munkach had a very large Jewish population. So he was from Palanca, and his family is one of the largest group of children to have survived. There are 7 siblings, and they all survived.
Wow.
So there's a strong connection. Unfortunately, none of my grandparents survive.
Let's show some of the photos that we have for you. I think there's a photo of you holding up the book at our event. There you are.
Yeah, my parents are in that book,
And
by the way.
your parents are in that book.
They are in that book.
And in what way?
My mother is featured and my father is featured with some of the recipes, which is kind of funny because my father can't even boil water.
Yeah.
But we put my mother's recipes and some of his favorite
Oh,
ones
that's
in there.
wonderful. All right, and then we have a photo of, explain that. Are those
So the small round plate, those are called pugachos. They're a Hungarian sour cream cookie. And I made those because they are one of my favorite cookies that my mother used to make. And they're also very nice. You roll them out so you can use them for any of the holidays if you want to create, Jewish stars or things like that. And I used to make them always on this upcoming holiday because they are a dairy cookie. And I also made another recipe called Eimetzwiebel, which is eggs and onions. My mother made it with eggs, onions, and potatoes. And that is sautéed onions, boiled eggs, and mashed, you mash
that
the potatoes.
lunch dish, or
It was like a lunch dish. It
dish?
was often served at Passover because you could eat it on matzah, which is like a cracker. And she made it for my son's bris. So again, it brings back the memories and
son's
the
bris
tie-ins.
is when your son is
My son was
circumcised
circumcised
and there's a party.
as
It's
part of
called
the
a bris.
covenant.
Right,
He
right.
was in the party.
All right, and there's another. Now let's look at some of the photos of your family that you started to talk to us about. Let's describe this one for
So
us.
that is my mother's family. I think there were 3 more children born after that, and there was a set of twins also that passed away very young. My mother is standing next to her mother, who's seated, and that's my mother, Ruth Gross, or Rivka. And then my Aunt Sally is the eldest, and then my
That's the blonde. Your
that's
Aunt
the
Sally.
blonde, and then my Aunt Knesset. My mother was the 3rd born, and then my grandfather, and then my uncle Yossi or Joseph. He had the mumps. But when the photographer came through once a year, that's when you got your picture taken. And those 4 children survived. Those were the eldest that survived. And as I said, my grandparents did not. But my mother and my Aunt Knesset, because they didn't really look alike and they had different colorings, were able to go through the war together. They both went off to work in Hungary and then came home and then went back to work in Romania. And then when they came home, so they were taken after the rest of their family. And
When,
because
44?
In 44.
Yeah.
And because they didn't look alike, they were in the concentration camps throughout together. And they said that really saved their lives, having each other.
Wow.
So
That's amazing.
When were they liberated?
they were liberated at the end of the war. And my mother, I can't remember all of the camps off the top of my head, but I know that she was in Bergen-Belsen and she was in Auschwitz.
Wow.
So
All right, now we have another photo, I think, of the other side of your family.
yeah, this is my dad's family. And as I said, all the children survived, and you can see that they worked very hard to finally have a girl. So there is my Uncle Philip is seated next to my grandmother Etta, and then my father, and then my Uncle Bill, and then my Uncle Ben, and then my Uncle Sam, and then the two in front are my Uncle Alex and my Aunt Rosie. And both my parents were the third, and of course neither of my grandparents survived.
But all of
All the children
siblings?
survived. My father was not in concentration camp. He was in a Hungarian labor camp where they marched them through the Carpathian Mountains. And they actually used him as the canary. So they would dig foxholes and they would drop him in to see if there was methane because he was so small.
Wow.
And my grandfather was a tailor and had lots of apprentices. So my parents actually met at one of the apprentices that grew up with my dad, married my mother's sister Sally, and they met at their wedding on my mom's birthday.
And where was this, in what
And
country?
that was in Nalipina, in the small town where my mother was from.
Yeah, in what country?
In Czechoslovakia, I'm sorry. They were both from Czechoslovakia, and they had their Czech papers, and that's how they managed to escape.
Wow.
I think there's a picture.
There's a picture of your parents, I think.
That's their engagement picture.
Wow.
My mother learned she was engaged when my father announced it in Prague to his brothers.
Now, is that an engagement ring she's wearing on her?
Well, this might have been after their wedding then. They always told me that it was an engagement, but it must have been after the wedding. I think you're right.
Is that a wedding ring?
Yeah, I think that's a wedding ring. They went to Prague because my uncles were there, and then it was, he said, too crowded, so they moved to another friend from the area. You know, there were no adults left to guide them, and this man was about 10 years older and was from their town, and they knew him well, so they moved to him. They got married in his house, and then eventually they had my brother about a little over a year after the wedding.
Oh, your brother was born in
My
Europe?
brother was born in Europe, and they moved to Osh, Czechoslovakia, which is on the border by Germany, because they knew the Soviets were coming, and in case their papers from America didn't come through in time, they were going to escape over the border again.
And but the papers came through, and when did they come to America?
The papers came through, and they came to America in 1949. My brother was 2. My bubby, my grandmother, on my mother's side, on my father's side, excuse me, all of her siblings, except she and a sister, emigrated to America before the war. And the 2 sisters were married. And they stayed. And actually the picture that was seen of my father's family, that was their passport picture. And they had a visa to come to America. And the head rabbi said they shouldn't go because it wasn't religious enough in America.
Really? Interesting.
So they did, so these uncles brought them all over. So they brought all my uncles and my aunt over. Although my Uncle Alex, the 2 that were in front, my Uncle Alex and my Aunt Rosie, did go to England after the war because they were young and they had been in concentration camp. They were sent to England to be educated. I'm sorry, my Uncle Sam was also, but then he went to fight in Israel. And we stayed very, very friendly with the people who basically raised them until they were 18.
That's great. And I think we have now a more modern photo of the family. Describe that. Wow.
So this was 15 years ago. And you can see that they have been fruitful and multiplied, as it is written. But the joy of this picture is that out of the Holocaust, they survived.
They survived.
And they went on. And my mother had always said that if she didn't make a life for herself, Hitler would have won.
Right, right.
And so you can see they're surrounded. This was my dad's 80th birthday, and they're surrounded by their children and spouses and grandchildren. They had 9 grandchildren, and now they have 3 great-grandchildren with 2 more on the way.
But your folks are gone now.
My father will be 95 in October,
Wonderful.
and my mother passed away at the age of 89 a year and a half ago.
Okay. Nice. All right, so to summarize, what else, besides the food that you prepared for our program, the cookies, what other foods do you remember most about growing up with your mom's cooking?
Well, I would say that in terms of baked goods, the one I remember the most is called a kakosh or a kuchen. And it somewhat resembles a babka. It's a yeasted sour cream coffee cake. It has a little bit more of a bready texture than a babka, and it is got tons of chocolate rolled in the middle of it. And it was absolutely everyone in my extended family's favorite, and the only one who has the recipe is my husband. Because when my mother came to take care of me when I had my daughter. My husband's an engineer, and she went to make it, and he stopped her, and he measured everything, and we have the recipe.
Yeah.
So that's probably one of our favorite, but there's everything else, you know, every Shabbos. There were just delicious dinners, chickens. I mentioned that we used to eat this thing that some people might gag at now, but it was called lingen kishka. A kishka is the intestine, I believe.
Right.
And this was the lung ground up with rice and
Right,
stuffed, and we would have that, and it was absolutely just wonderful. And dairy dishes that I remember that I loved and my children loved, and we used to freeze it so we could have it for the upcoming holiday of Shavuot. It's kind of like a gnocchi. It's called a shlishka. It's like a potato dough, small, and then she would also make kreplach, but not the meat kreplach that go in soup. It was filled with prune butter, lekvar, and she would fry that in breadcrumbs, and we would always have that and balinces
Oh, wow.
on Shavuot, and those are probably our absolute
Great.
favorites in my family.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, let's turn to Judy, and we have a photo of a couple. You'll describe. Who's that?
Those are my parents. That's their wedding picture. My dad was in the Army. He enlisted before he became a citizen after he enlisted. And they got married, as most of their compatriots did, on a Sunday afternoon in the rabbi's study, you know, with 6 other
Now,
people.
where is this taking
Oh,
place?
in Manhattan, New York City.
In
They
New
all
York,
lived in Washington
after
Heights.
they came.
After
Describe.
they came, my mother
Okay.
came in 1938 by herself. Her sister, at the age of 16, her older sister had come the year before. When she turned 16, they came to live with a sponsor in New York City. My dad had been sent in 1937. He came with his younger brother. He was 17. His brother was 15. My grandparents, my father's parents stayed behind. They only got out in 1945. They had to actually walk over the Pyrenees to get to Lisbon and a boat to leave. And my grandmother, my aunt, who were left behind, by the time papers were arranged for them, by the time they got papers to come see the United States, their assets had been frozen. And the money couldn't be gotten in to get them, and actually there had been passage arranged to Cuba for them, but they were not able to get out.
But you said some of the family perished back home.
My grandmother and my
grandmother
aunt.
and your aunt.
My aunt was 14 when she was deported, and my grandmother was 52. And I came to learn those facts after I went back to visit 5
Tell
years
us
ago.
about that. You had a very interesting trip a little while ago.
I did. The town that my mother is from in Germany, well, the Holocaust is a huge part of the school curriculum in Germany. And high school students are encouraged to find the story of a teenager who perished in the Holocaust. And in my mother's town of Alzey,
What's the name of the town?
Alzey. It's
Alzey.
an hour south of Frankfurt.
Okay.
My dad is from the Black Forest, which is almost on the French border.
Right.
In that town, they had already done a memorial to my aunt in front of the house where they grew up. My grandfather was a butcher, so it was a butcher shop was on the ground floor, and they lived above it. And this memorial, which was made by a group of special ed kids, so it was very simple. It was tiles, several tiles depicting my aunt's life. They knew that she liked to knit and crochet.
And how did they get that information?
There's a small museum there, and where they have collected several, Holocaust-related things. And at the time that memorial was built, which would be like maybe almost 20 years ago now, there were still people who remembered them.
Okay.
And they got that information from them. In 2012, a group of high school students decided to do a video reenactment of my aunt's life as their project.
Wow.
And when they did that, they made a great effort to locate my mother and my aunt who had come here, but because both of them had gotten married, they couldn't, no one was able to find them. But there was an English teacher at that school who had been there for 25 years, an American woman who had just moved back to the States. And right around that time, my father passed away, and my mother's maiden name was in the obituary.
Her maiden name was in
The
the
obituary.
obituary.
So I got a call from Germany saying, we've been looking for your family for a long time. We have this video. It's won a couple of awards in Germany. We're having a big ceremony to show the video to the town and also to put Stolperstein, which is these brass cobblestones in front of the buildings of people from Alsace who've been deported, who were deported. We're going to have, that's going to be part of the same ceremony, and can you come? And so my sister and I and my daughter and my brother-in-law and a cousin, we all went there for this ceremony. And when they sent me this video to watch before I went there, it was in German. It hadn't have subtitles, but it really didn't require translation. They reenact the scene where my aunt and my grandmother take my mother to the train station and put her on the train so she can get on the boat and come to the United States. It was unbelievable. So they've now subtitled it and given me the rights to that. So when I go to high schools to talk about my family, I have this DVD to show, which is really...
Isn't it interesting how Germany, more than any other country, of course, has done so much in recent years, not so much 20, 30 years ago, but in the past 10, 20 years, to memorialize the Holocaust.
There's still a lot of shame and remorse around that experience.
And I love this. Have you seen the stepping stones? Do they have them in your town where they put stones in front of the homes that were lived in by Holocaust people who perished in the Holocaust?
By the time my grandmother and my aunt were deported, there were only 14 Jews left in the town, and they were all living in one apartment.
And approximately how many Jews were there before?
I don't know, but there was a sizable population. My grandfather was a butcher. A lot of them were business
people.
Was
that a small town, a big, medium city?
Like maybe 50, 60,000 people totally spared during the war because of some mistake. It was not bombed. It was not ruined. It's really a lovely...
Was there a synagogue that was...
There was a synagogue there, and there's a wall of that synagogue still standing.
So it was destroyed on Kristallnacht, probably?
My mother left 2 weeks before Kristallnacht.
Which was in 1938, November.
2 weeks before. She just got out right before that. But things were very bad in Germany. She talks a lot about the lack of, there was no food, and things were pretty bleak.
Yeah. Well, let's look at the next photo, which is the dish that you made that was a remembrance of your mom. So tell us about it.
Well, this is actually a bread that my father's family made. So this is Hutzelbrot, which is really means...
Say that again?
Hutzelbrot. Hutzel is actually dried pears.
Okay.
So this is a bread that actually, my father originally developed the recipe, the paper recipe I have from him, from my grandmother's cookbook, which I have here. It's from 1895.
You're going to show us that. We want to see that.
It kind of falls apart when you open it. So the recipe in that book makes it in bulk. So you use like 10 pounds of dried pears. So my father had pared that down and translated it, and the recipe he left behind, my parents have passed away, is basically a list of ingredients. So I sort of had to go back and remember how I watched them make it. And they also made it in what I consider to be bulk, maybe 5-10 loaves at a time. And it takes, and I'd never made it myself. So when this program came up, I said, here's my opportunity to, because all my siblings had said, when are we going to get together and do that? And of course, we never do. So I had to take this list of ingredients and sort of find a more modern version of it on the internet. And that gave me sort of directions what to do with all these giant piles of all these prunes and pears and raisins.
It looks very intricate. Looks very intricate on that.
It's mostly dried fruit with very little yeast dough. So, but it's very hard to knead because you have to knead in like 5 pounds of dried pears. It's a labor of love, and it takes 2 days to make it because you have to soak the fruit and cut it up. And but I remember my parents saying how much work it was, but they did this together. And for them, I think it was almost therapeutic to sort of do this thing that was a flavor of their childhood. Not necessarily so much a Jewish food, because I don't think anybody there had ever seen it before, but pretty much a German food, and very much a Black Forest food from where my dad was from. So I really enjoyed making it, and my siblings all agreed that I nailed it. It tasted pretty much as they had remembered.
You still have some left over? You made so much?
Oh, well, I sliced it and froze it, but I think my husband has nibbled away at that over the last few months.
Do you eat it with cream cheese or butter?
It's actually very good if you toast it a little bit and you put a little bit of cream cheese on it. It really doesn't need it, but yeah, it's very good. But oddly, my mother also made a yeast a yeast dough recipe that's very similar to what you described with the sour cream and the cocoa. Also had cinnamon in it. So, and instead of it being made into a cake, she made individual rolled up. It's like a cinnamon bun almost, but it was more chocolate in it than cinnamon. And they call that Schneckennoodle because it was like snake, like you rolled it out like a snake. And then you put all the ingredients, the sugar and the cinnamon and the cocoa and the sour cream, and then you rolled it up and made 12 of them in a pan and baked them. So
my mother made hers in a bunt pan. But she also used the same recipe to make what we call deltblach, which would have either jam in the middle of it, or it might have kind of like a balinsa filling with the sweetened, farmer's cheese, in the middle of it.
Pot cheese. I think farmer's cheese is more.
Yeah.
Linseed and pot cheese.
I think it's coming
I
back.
think it depends on the
farmer's
recipe.
cheese,
Yeah.
like mascarpone.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, so show us this cookbook. I know it's very fragile.
So this is sort of my thought when I saw this cookbook was when you're fleeing Hitler, you take a cookbook. I don't know why they wanted to bring the cookbook, but this cookbook I discovered is available online in its entirety.
Yeah.
It's from
What's 18?
It's called the New Cookbook from 1895, and it's got the various cuts
And
of
published
beef.
in Germany.
Published in Germany.
Written in German.
Written in German. It's printed in Stuttgart, which is close to where my father is from. And the recipe for the bread I made is this one tiny paragraph. One tiny paragraph.
Wow.
That's it. And it says to cook it, just the end of it says bake it until it's done. Of course.
There are a lot of recipes with directions like that.
Bake until it's done. Or mix
Put it in
until.
hot oven.
Right, but you figure back then an oven was.
They didn't have degrees.
There was a knob on it that said it, yeah.
And the person who translated it for me said he wanted the recipe that was right after it, which is another recipe that my mother made frequently, which was Zwiebelkuchen, which is onion cake. Which I will attempt at some point.
Well, my mother was almost 90 when she finally had her write down a recipe for chicken soup. But it wasn't very much direction, just this and that, nothing specific, but it was still nice to have. All right, that's wonderful. Let's turn to Karen B now, okay.
Well, Karen R. and Estelle, I'm not sure which one of you is signed, but she sent me not only the recipe, but the explanation that I'm assuming appeared in the book.
Yes.
And it was that miracle. And
It was this book, and what I really loved about this book, as compared to this one, where you really couldn't follow the recipes. They were there as a memory, but many of them had things missing and so on. This one at least attempted to fill in the blanks, but also gave us the information on the people, which was lovely.
And we have a photo of you, Karen B., at the event, telling the story of the person, right?
Yeah. And well, before I tell him, the recipe I did was a poppy seed cake. And I should have made another one, but I didn't think of that soon enough. But there's a little story that goes before that, because I had only ever made a poppy seed cake before with the recipe from my friend Helena. But I happened to be talking to my friend Sandy, and I said, I'm going to use that recipe that Helena gave me. She said, no, it's my recipe that I gave to her, and now you're going to use.
All right.
Okay, all right. I will now attribute it to my Sioux City friends, which is the name of the city where I met them. This recipe was submitted by a daughter of Edward Hilfstein.
Do we have a photo of him? I think we have a picture of the
Yeah, I
man.
think he's there. Well, he was there.
Yeah, what was his name?
Philip.
No,
Edward Hilfstein.
Here he is, okay.
Yeah, that was when he was young. He did come to the United States fairly young, and he was born in Krakow, Poland in 1924 to his mother and father, and he had two sisters. It's interesting because his father was a hairstylist, and there were several other family members who did that, but he had an uncle who was a very renowned doctor, and his name was Dr. Chaim Hilfstein, and there was a school named after him, and he was at that school when schools were denied in 1939 to the Polish Jews. And in November 1939, since he wasn't going to school, he was sent to work. And, you know, a friend of his father's got him papers to be a plumber. And he still had to wear his yellow star. And then everything stopped. People had to turn in their valuables, food was scarce, and his father's business was given to the Poles. But his father was sent to this place called Stalowa Wola, and his mother and sisters were sent on a cattle car to Treblinka, where they were killed. And it seemed like this man, Eddie, had just had a bunch of luck. And the one thing he did, he heard of Oskar Schindler when he was at a camp called Brunitz. And then from another camp called Plaskow, he survived 2 different lineups where people were sent to death.
Wow.
And eventually he got to Schindler's because on a train he met his cousin, the doctor, and Schindler needed a doctor and a plumber.
Wow. Perfect, yeah.
And then, you know, things happened, and he met his wife on a trip to Buffalo, New York, and he decided to keep up the family business. He became a hairstylist.
Yeah.
But I used their recipe for poppy seed cake because it was easier than my friends.
Oh.
And it turned out well.
It is interesting when you listen to some of the survivors' stories, the amount of just absolute sheer luck.
Yeah.
They just missed the train, or they just managed to get off, or the guard turned his head and they ran away. Something,
Yeah.
just destiny. So interesting.
No question.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, let's turn back to Karen now, and you've got something. You want to show us something from the recipe book?
I did 2 recipes, and this one came from the recipe book, and it was New Year's Eve herring salad. And I chose it because, again, from my childhood, every simcha, every happy event, there was always food. Even sad events, we always had food. And there was always herring. And I remember just reading the recipe and thinking about this and just tasting it in my head. So I decided that I would do this recipe too, and I hadn't looked at the person at all. The recipe was very good. It had apples in it and sour cream, and what could be bad? But more interesting to me was the woman who had given them this recipe, and her name was Olga Drucker. And I think we have a picture of Olga.
We have a picture of her as a little girl, right?
Right, we have a picture of her as a little girl. And she...
There she is. Wow.
When she was not much older than this, she was sent to Kindertransport, which was an operation sending children to England so that they would be out of harm's way. And when she got older, she came to America, and she helped produce a documentary on Kindertransport, and from a book that she had written about it. And I have this really wonderful quote from her that I used that evening that I'd like to share now.
Sure.
She was often asked, could a Holocaust happen in America? And her response was, of course. And then she goes on to say, it occurs to me, are we not asking the wrong question? Rather, shouldn't the question be, what will we do about it? Is vigilance enough? Vigilance and awareness are important, but is it enough? So this is my answer to the right question. What we have to do is to tell our children, and especially our grandchildren, this is what we have to tell them. Look to education. Learn history, our own personal history as well as the history of the United States of America. And this is very important, the history of the world. It is imperative that we all, especially our leaders, begin to learn from history. The enemy is not so much intolerance or even anti-Semitism. it's complacency. And I think that's a lesson we need to remember over and over again.
Another word for complacency you hear is indifference.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Or not just indifference, but not doing anything, just letting things happen. And not that we think that that's what happened in Germany, but it's what could happen here, where we feel a sense of safety, just as most German Jews did, and to just let things happen and get out of hand, not understanding that we have to do something.
I think that most American Jews, and I know my mother spoke this way, she wasn't in the Holocaust, but she escaped in 1921 from Russia, from the pogroms and the civil war in Russia, and she escaped over the border from the Ukraine into Romania, lived there for 2 years, and came from Bucharest to Ellis Island in 1923. To her, America and New York, where she came, was the safe haven of all havens. And when she went to Israel some years later, several trips, she met some people at Yad Vashem, some students in the university who were doing papers on Jewish history. And one of the girls spoke with us and said, I'm doing a paper on why all Jews around the world should come to Israel, because Israel is your only safe haven if you're Jewish. And I remember my mother arguing with her and saying, oh no, U.S., New York, America is our safe haven. Nothing could ever happen there to us. And this young woman, this Israeli young woman, said, well, Mrs. Epstein, I think you're wrong. If it could happen in Germany, it can happen in America. And I think Americans don't realize that. And I listened to that conversation. The young woman sent us her paper, which reiterated that, and I argued with my mother about it some more. And I sort of agreed with my mother. I think don't you think most American Jews do agree? But maybe now those ideas are seeping in that maybe we're not always safe and protected.
The
What do you
German
think?
Jews thought they were totally integrated. I mean, in the stories, I know people were telling even that night, my grandfather served in the army, and
My grandfather won the Iron Cross.
you
in
know,
World
and
War I.
they weren't going to touch
Protect
us.
him. No.
Didn't matter.
I think
What do
that
you
my
think?
parents, my mother especially, because my father really didn't talk about it till we got older, but we always knew that they were survivors. And my mother talked, and she also began talking to school groups.
Did she remain suspicious here?
I think my mother always felt that it could happen anywhere.
My mother was like that
And
too.
I think that's why they felt so strongly about Israel. They loved America. And they did, some of my uncles did incredibly well in America, and they made lives for themselves, but they always felt it could happen here.
And because of that, they became strong supporters of Israel.
Very strong supporters of Israel. And also, my mother became very involved not only in Israeli organizations, but also here for the downtrodden. So she would go to mental facilities that had institutions that had young adults, or she would go to the nursing homes, the Jewish nursing homes.
We had a 4-H club, and my mother was also active in my Girl Scout troop, and she was adamant that we include, there was a child in my class who had cerebral palsy, and my mother brought her into the group, and that was unheard of in 1955. You
Yeah.
know,
Well, I think we have a strong tradition of social justice and strong unions. I grew up, my grandmother was in the workers' circle and a strong socialist unionist, very powerful, very, very liberal. I think we were taught that we suffered, and we have to be cognizant of others who are suffering, and we have to help them. And my parents were in the NAACP back in the 50s, when many white people weren't involved. So I think that is part of our tradition.
Well,
No
isn't it
question.
also because they saw what had happened? It was anybody who was different and considered not quite as human in some fashion. And a lot of people felt that way about the disabled.
Yeah, and the connection with food too. Thinking about my mother was an executive director of a big synagogue complex in Valley Stream, New York, and she started a thing called a Yiddish Winkel because she was a Yiddishist and spoke Yiddish. And every 2 weeks you went to the Winkel or the corner and you could only speak Yiddish. You couldn't speak Yiddish. So it was keeping the language alive. And every year she held a huge 300, 400, 500 people herring and potato supper for the Yiddish Winkel. So there you go, the combination of our heritage with the foods, the foods that we eat, very important to keep that legacy going. And are our children keeping that up though? I wonder. I think we have a generation, the millennials and our young people feel so secure, and maybe the word is complacent. They don't have to worry about their synagogues are not being bombed, their civil rights are not being tested too much. They feel safe.
I don't know if that's the case so much.
No.
I know, well, my children are Asian, so I worry about that a lot.
In today's climate, you
yes,
worry
I
about
do.
that.
And I think my worry is fueled by my mother's suspicion. Who, even though she was here and safe, she would always say if she spent time with somebody that she said, I could tell they really were anti-Semitic. And where are you getting that from? But she always said it was a feeling. It was a feeling.
Right. Well, let's summarize today. We're almost out of time. This has been wonderful, and I hope that people will get to see it. And we've preserved a great program that you helped put on. Thank Karen and everyone who helped her with the program. So I'll start, and then we'll go around and see your final thoughts about this. So what this program meant is it showed us the legacy of our people, the importance of knowing our history, our genealogy, and how important it is the connection to our families, and the food being one huge part of that family connection. So what are your lessons from this?
I think in preparing for this program, I dug deep into what I remembered and what I had learned over the years, and I felt that it was a positive thing to do, to remember these women who struggled so hard and tried to keep in mind what their lives had been like and hoped for the future, that's what their children's life would be again. And I was proud to be a part of this program.
We have a couple of minutes.
I think one thing that I took away from this is I always said I would weigh and measure and watch my parents do it and learn how to do it, and then it was too late.
Okay.
So I think if you have a special recipe or memory
Write it
around
down.
food is roll up your sleeves and get dirty and learn how to do it.
Right, and write it down.
Yes.
Karen?
I can only agree with what's been said, and there was no question that this struck a chord with everybody that was there that night.
Right, and Estelle?
I would say it's to honor what these people went through, to remember, so that we not only don't repeat it, but that we pass along what they learned, and to continue the traditions and to continue that conversation, and really to honor it at the cellular level.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
And on behalf of these wonderful people from Hadassah, I want to thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week on takeback.org. Good night.